Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Dr. Marty Olaf, Director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. Today, we are talking about a veritable institution, not just for the Wiregrass region and not just for the state of Alabama, but for our country. The late Representative John Lewis, whose name adorns one of the halls here at Troy University, John Robert Lewis Hall, one of the most influential civil rights leaders and politicians in our nation, and he hails from right here in the Wiregrass region. Marty, tell me a little bit about John Lewis and why he is such a key figure and a beloved figure here in our area.
It's interesting that you would say beloved because when I was growing up in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, John Lewis may have been one of the most hated individuals among white folks in the entire nation. John Lewis was very young. He was born in 1940. He's not only from the Wiregrass, he's from Pike County, just outside of the city limits of Troy, where there is now a marker in front of his family home put up by the Alabama Historical Association and the John R. Lewis Legacy Foundation, which is a family foundation with the Lewis family, dedicated to voter registration, civic activism, and things that John Lewis himself was active in. So we know about John Lewis being the congressman from Atlanta. He was a freedom rider in 1961 in the buses that burned and the people that were beaten in Montgomery and Birmingham. He was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a younger, more radical alternative to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, even though he himself was also a preacher. He was a speaker and preceded Martin Luther King in the 1963 March on Washington, where they had to ask him. They didn't just ask him, they cajoled him for hours and hours and hours to tone down the radicalism of his speech. And it's still the most radical of all the speeches delivered on that day in August. He was an antagonist of Martin Luther King Jr., and he became an ally of Martin Luther King Jr. after a while. He was the leader, the man literally out in front at the 1965 Bloody Sunday March in Selma. He was the first person whose head got cracked at that march. Well, he was born out near Dunn's Chapel AME Church, just a few miles to the east of Troy, the city of Troy, again in 1940. And my interest in John Lewis is not only his civil rights work and his post-civil rights work. My real interest, driven by a couple of collections that we have at the Wiregrass Archives, is in his early education. He was educated in the Pike County schools that were racially segregated at that time, and he discusses his education in his 1996 autobiography entitled Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement. Now, in this autobiography, he talks only a little about his education. There's a chapter devoted to his early years and a few pages devoted to his early education, because the real point of that book is, of course, his civil rights career and his post-movement career in politics, getting into and advocating that other people get into, as he called it, good trouble. But like I said, I'm interested in this early manifestation. He talks a little bit about it.
But you really had to go and seek out a lot of this information because he didn't talk about it as extensively as he did his other aspects of his life. So I imagine that was, for a historian like you, that's part of the fun and the challenge, is finding some of this information along the way.
There is nothing like, as you might say, plowing a field that has never been plowed before. But you run into a lot of stumps that way. And so everything that I'm about to say is based in the records that I have, but it might not paint a complete picture, and a lot more work ought to be done, because it gives us not only a view into the man and into the mind of the man, but it gives us, using him as a lens, it gives us a view into the infrastructure of education and life in this section of the Wiregrass.
Well, tell me a little bit about John Lewis's childhood and his education that you've learned from these collections. What was his childhood like?
Well, the first school he went to, Dunn's Chapel School, is supposedly, it burned down because it was a wooden school. And supposedly it was right behind Dunn's Chapel AME Church. And it shows up on a couple of maps as being right behind Dunn's Chapel AME Church, which is on Gardner Bassett Road, just east of Troy. You can still find Dunn's Chapel AME right now, but it's a new church building. And from what I can determine, looking at the maps and talking to people and reading about Dunn's Chapel School, I think that the current brick chapel, the church, is in the spot of the former school. However, right next door to Dunn's Chapel is the John Lewis family home. This is really the home of his mother and the rest of his family. Anyway, they have this Alabama Historical Association marker in their front yard identifying this as the birthplace of John R. Lewis. And so I drove up to the marker. I mean, I'd never been out in that neighborhood before, so it's like, oh gosh, where is John Lewis's house? Oh, well, there's a marker that says this is John Lewis's house. So I drove up into the yard, and they've got a spot. You know, they know people are driving up into the yard, and so they've got a spot for it. I got out of the car and I went over to it, and a couple of the family members, one of Lewis's brothers and one of his nephews, who's associated with the John R. Lewis Legacy Foundation, they were out working. It's still a working farm. They were out working some of their animals, and they both came over, and we had a long chat. And the brother pointed me to a dirt road across the street, across Garner Bassett Road from Dunn's Chapel, and said the school was up there, and there are still ruins of it. So I drove up there and I looked at it, and honestly, I don't think it is. And it's not a later iteration, because that school, after it burned, was never rebuilt. I'm not sure what's up in there. It was real snaky looking, and I wasn't going to go walking around in street shoes up in this wooded area. But there's a ruins up there. But it's large blocks, and so I'm not sure that that's Dunn's Chapel.
Because Dunn's Chapel School did burn down, correct? At some
point?
point?
I believe in 1957.
Wow.
Either 1955 or 1957. Well, John Lewis, going by the name Robert, which he went by for years and years and years, first began in 1946, which is about a quarter mile from his family home. And it was a whitewashed wooden building. He said it had a green painted roof and badly repaired steps. So, you know, the steps are the first things to go unless they're covered. He wrote that his mother and even the generation before his mother had attended this 2-room school with grades 1 to 3 on one side and grades 4, 5, and 6 on the other side. This was not uncommon in white rural schools and in black schools, even in cities, to have the grades mixed like that. It's only been since World War II, well after World War II, that we've made a point of dividing each grade separately. And that comes partly from consolidating schools, having enough of a population to be able to afford teachers for each one of the grades. But his mother and the generation before her went to the same school, and they hadn't improved the school very much since then. 5 years before he went to Dunn's Chapel School, so that means in 1941, the Alabama school surveys reported that Dunn's Chapel was slated to be demolished when transportation to a consolidated school became available. And ultimately it did, but it was in the late 1950s before that transportation was made available to take the Dunn's Chapel students to a school about 5 miles away. So at school, in his autobiography in 1996, he wrote that students fetched water from a nearby farmhouse because there was no water on the school grounds. They each had and I found this pretty fascinating, they each had a drinking cup that must have been metal or ceramic or glass or something up on a shelf above the water pail. And so if you needed a drink of water, you went to that water pail and you dipped some water into your own cup, and you maintained that cup for yourself. His classroom, of course, had a pot-bellied stove. And we always think of this as being very romantic, but pot-bellied stoves are really hot when you're right next to them and cold if you're more than about 10 feet away from them, which is fine in the summer because you're not running them in the summer, but in the winter it can be a little bit obnoxious. And also they're dirty. Anytime you're dealing with live fire, then the ash and the fuel, you're just covered with dirt. And so, yeah, if you have a romance for pot-bellied stoves, you got to remember you got to have a romance for dirt too. They had a large blackboard that local people had either contributed to or had put up, and sometimes the blackboards in these little schools were just black paint on a wall that then the teacher would write in white chalk on them. There was a teacher's desk and a homemade Alabama state flag. So one or more of the people who could sew in the community had made a state flag for the school.
Wow.
The school spent a little bit of money buying other furnishings and materials whenever it had funds. And one of the ways they got funds was to have carnivals and festivals. And John Lewis talks about one of those festivals, and he talks about his favorite game.
This is an interesting game that I think we should bring back.
The game is called Fireball. Now, I really hesitate to describe this game because people listening to this podcast might decide this is a really good idea, especially if, as we say, alcohol was involved. So do not do this the first time if alcohol is involved. But John Lewis describes Fireball. And I contacted a friend of mine who is in the Eufaula area, a well-known Fireball enthusiast, Doug Purcell, the former executive director of the Historic Chattahoochee Commission. And he confirmed that this is the same game that he still plays occasionally. It's a small wad of cloth. For John Lewis, it was about the size of a baseball. Doug Purcell said they used them about the size of softballs. That is then wrapped a couple of times in a long leader of cloth so you can swing it. Well, the name Fireball, we got the ball part right. So Fireball is kind of self-explanatory. You soak that ball of fabric in some kind of flammable liquid, and gasoline works best because of the color of the flame. And then you light it and you swing it around and you throw it. And really the point, and John Lewis talks about this, you don't swing it horizontally above your head, partly because the fire is going to fall on you. You swing it vertically and in a clockwise manner so that you can release it and it will shoot up into the air like a falling star. And that was the thing that really attracted John Lewis. He could buy 5 for $1. And you don't do this in dry conditions.
No, not at all. Kids don't try this at home.
Definitely kids don't try this at home. Yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing that if I was a college student, I would have done if I'd known about it and gotten into serious trouble doing it. So college kids, don't try this at home.
Yes, there were many an outings at the. We used to live. My roommates and I in college here at Troy used to live at an old wooden house on Elm Street that has subsequently, not through our doing, I assure you, it was the generation after us, burned to the ground eventually. So we would have certainly hastened that building's demise had we attempted this game in those days.
Yeah, I lived in the same circumstances when I was a graduate student at Auburn, and we had a wall that lath and plaster, and we'd stand across the room and throw darts at the dart target that was there, and we were not good. So this lath and plaster wall looked like we had executed somebody against it. And it was just chipped up all over the place. The realtor let us out of our lease, oddly enough. What John Lewis remembers from 1950-51 was that his teacher was Miss Althea Williams. He remembers her in her memoir, and we found her Alabama Teacher's Register book in our collection. And we got that Teacher's Register book because the Pike County School Board had packed away all of these permanent records. They're mandated by the state to be permanent. They had for years packed away these records in the Rock House here in Troy. Well, that was being sold, and everybody who had collections in this veritable cave had to move those collections. And after the County Board of Education had done its due diligence, it contacted the State Archives, or Alabama Department of Archives and History. They could not take the collection, and so they asked us if we would take it. The world of archives in Alabama is very small. We all know each other. And they asked me if I would take it at the Wiregrass Archives, and we accepted this collection because it had something to do with the Wiregrass. We hope it leverages similar collections, and it has leveraged one other collection for us. Anyway, we took this, and that's a story in and of itself. These were not kept in good condition through no fault of anybody currently associated with the County Board of Education, but they're moldy and they're mildewed and they're wet and runny. We keep box after box wrapped up inside of industrial strength bags, plastic bags. But I did find a number of these for John Lewis, and I can place him in classes frequently, under the name Robert Lewis. In 1951, Ms. Williams was teaching 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and she was teaching them reading and math and health and spelling and English and writing and geography and science from books that had been discarded by the white school systems. That was very common in Alabama, that black school systems got these cast-off books that were not only old, but very much out of date. Then in grades 7 and 8, Lewis traveled 8 miles over to Banks Junior High. Now, of course, this was in a segregated system, so there were 2 Banks Junior High schools. This one was located on State Highway 93, just south of the Banks Town Center, and it was a cluster of cinder block buildings with outdoor bathrooms. All the teachers were women, and Ms. Horton was the principal. Then in 1967, Pike County used state equalization funds to build on that same site the Bethel School. Bethel School later served as Banks Elementary School, and as of March 2025, houses the Sprout Learning Center for kids aged 0 through 5. Only a few of the students who entered first grade went on to enter high school. This was a little bit better in the white community than in the black community, but not much, so the persistence rates were very low. And even fewer of them than entered high school graduated from high school. So there's a big drop-off, enormous drop-off. But John Lewis was one of the few that did make it all the way through. The 1954 school census shows him at Pike County Training School.
And what about his studies? What were his interests when he was a student?
Well, you have all students do basically the same thing. He ended up in vocational agriculture because that's what was on offer at the high school level for African American students. He studied history, he studied English lit, biology, algebra, and oddly enough, home economics. All of his teachers came from Alabama State, at that point, Negro College in Montgomery. And all of his peers appear to have made the most of their academic background. They took this fairly seriously, regardless of their grades. They seem to be very serious about studenting. And this is the thing that lets me believe that. Of the 37 members of his 1957 graduating class, Lewis reports that 10 went on to college. He himself rolled in Nashville's American Baptist Theological Seminary. And then when he finished his course of studies there, which were only a couple of years, he transferred over to Fisk University, probably the second most prominent African-American college in the South after Tuskegee, which still was more or less a vocational college, whereas Fisk was an academic school.
And there's, of course, a very famous story that I was privy to when I covered the opening of John Robert Lewis Hall about him applying to this very institution. Tell me a little bit about that story.
Sure, and most of this comes out of two sources. His 1996 autobiography, again, Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement, and out of attorney Fred Gray's autobiography called Bus Ride to Justice, published in 1995. But John Lewis applied to Troy State College at the time, and he knew he would not be accepted. But he had approached Martin Luther King Jr., who he heard speak in 1955, and the movement's attorney, Fred Gray. Fred Gray had been Rosa Parks' attorney. He had been Browder v. Gale attorney, and he was basically Martin Luther King's attorney and SCLC's attorney. He's still alive, and the last I heard, he was still practicing law out of Tuskegee. Anyway, he talked about suing Troy to be allowed to go, and this was not uncommon in 1957-ish, where African-American students really considered suing schools. But he says in his autobiography that while he was willing to stand up to what he knew would be abusive treatment because he was trying to force the hand of a white institution, he knew that it would fall on his parents as well, and with potentially very dire consequences, potentially economic consequences. People got fired for doing this kind of stuff, or for being even related to students who sued because they had to either agree to it or give permission directly, or they were guilt by association. And if you want somebody to stop something, punish your relatives.
Right. Yes. And this was a huge concern of his.
Very concerned.
Which is why he never went that direction.
And he never did sue. And I think that Fred Gray probably thought that maybe it was not as strong a case as it would be a few years later. It probably wasn't ripe. Fred Gray was the attorney for Harold Franklin, who was a student from Alabama State in 1964 that desegregated, I hesitate to say integrated. He was the first black student who registered at Auburn University. And Fred Gray was there for that activity as well. So John Lewis's suit probably not ripe in 1957, but by 1963, then these lawsuits were ripe. We're not really sure at this point, at least I'm not, who the first African-American student was in Troy State College, but the first African-American student that I'm aware of appears in the Palladium, I believe, in 1967. So it was doubtless a very quiet desegregation.
And we're talking a decade later that this happens from the John Lewis era.
Yeah. Well, in 1954, Brown versus Board said that segregation could not be equal. Separate was not equal. And then in 1955, almost exactly a year later, in what's called Brown 2, the Supreme Court informed states that they had to proceed, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed. Well, in Alabama, all deliberate speed meant 1967.
Right. And circling back to the beginning of our conversation today, you mentioned that, I mentioned that now, today, I don't think it's controversial at all to say that Representative Lewis is beloved and he's revered by people for his bravery and standing up to causes, but that wasn't the case at the time. It's interesting, his trajectory in terms of public consciousness mirrors that of Martin Luther King, of Muhammad Ali, of many of the figures from that era, from that civil rights era, who went from being these reviled figures among particularly among whites in the South, to now one of these revered figures, perhaps not on the level of an Ali or Martin Luther King in terms of the reverence, but still certainly someone that is spoken of fondly. And it's interesting how time has changed that.
It very much is interesting how time has changed that. Now, John Lewis continued to agitate and educate throughout his entire career. So we're not as far away from the end of his career as we are from the end of Ali's career or from the end of Martin Luther King's career. And so we don't have quite enough distance yet to mythologize him like we have mythologized these other individuals. But we'll get around to it because that's what we do with all of our historical figures, is we end up resurrecting them and mythologizing them because we finally understand the value that they brought, even if what they brought at the time was very painful.
And that's as good a summary as any of the mission of the Wiregrass Archives and preserving history and bringing attention to these figures. Well, thank you, Dr. Olaf, for joining me again for another episode of It Came from the Archives. And once again, I'd like to remind people they can find these columns on our Troy Today blog, today.troy.edu. And of course, you can always find any of this information at the Wiregrass Archives, which you can find digitally, or of course at our Troy University Dothan campus. So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass Archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. It helps other people find the show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olaf, Director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.